Hey, John Gard back again to tell you everything you need to know about moldboard plowshares. I'll show you how to identify what you've got, how to maintain your plowshare, how to give it a slight rebuild, and how to give it a total rebuild. So let's start off with the Blacksmith plowshare. This was the design from probably the late 1800s when manufacturers started getting their manufacturing methods figured out and somewhat standardized across the industry up until the 1950s. The Blacksmith share is characterized by this long, sharp, well-defined point, very fine-tuned, sharp cutting edge, a gunnel welded on the side here that serves as the land side of the share. Most Blacksmith shares used a quick attach method where the share would have a pin here and some kind of draw bolt arrangement or even an over-center lever to pull the share onto the frog. J.I. Case was the exception where they used 3 bolts that simply bolted the share onto the frog. The name of the share, the Blacksmith share, comes from the fact that you did not simply throw the share away once it was worn out and once there was no suck left in the share. Take it to your blacksmith and the blacksmith would put it into the forge and heat up the cutting edge. He couldn't do it all at once, he would do it in sections. He would heat it up and then put it into a strip hammer and pull that material down and pull it into a sharp cutting edge again, and he'd do that all along the cutting edge until you'd have a nice sharp cutting edge again. You could repeat this process a few times until there wasn't enough material here left to draw out anymore. In which case, you would take it back to your blacksmith and he would do a rebuild on it where he would replace the point, weld the cutting edge onto here, and then you'd be back in business. You could repeat that whole process a few times until that share would start getting worn right here. This is right here is your biggest wear point on a share, and the material right here would start to get paper thin. I've seen shares where this and the gunnel would start to separate, and once this gets wore down, you're not protecting the moldboard anymore. At that point, you would finally give the share a chuck and break down and buy a brand new plowshare. Today, I have a hard time throwing these shares away even when they're really wore, because if I'm really hard up and if it's a share that's hard to find, I still want this, gentle curve here in the mounting arrangement, and hopefully I could rebuild this if I had to. Now, if you are from the Northeast US or Eastern Canada, this plowshare would look more familiar to you. I don't know if this was called a Blacksmith share years ago, but it follows the same design where you've got a gunnel as a part of your share. Most of the time they're just bolted on. I've seen some that are steel, so that could be rebuilt by a blacksmith, but most of them I've seen are cast, and I don't know if there's any rebuilding to that, so I guess you would just grind on it to bring that cutting edge back, and once it's worn, and you'd give her a chuck. In the 1950s, manufacturers came up with a transitional design where they used a separate point and a separate plowshare. The idea being it was no longer a blacksmith share. You could throw the pieces away when they were wore out, and you would go through 2 or more points before you'd have to replace the share. This particular example is an international plow chief arrangement, which was introduced in 1950. Minneapolis Moline had a version of this, and you could almost call the John Deere Chisel point that was from the 1940s a variation on this design. The idea was you'd throw these pieces away when they're wore out, but farmers are a stingy lot, and I've seen points and shares that have been rebuilt. The separate point and share design did not last long before manufacturers went to what I call the throwaway lay. The idea being it was a simple, low-cost design that was meant to be thrown away when it was worn out. Designs included a simple flat share, sometimes called a blade share, ones with a upset point, with just the point being bent down to create some suck, and the deep suck point. International introduced the Super Chief bottom in 1956, which included throwaway lays. John Deere introduced the HS bottom sometime in the 1950s, and Oliver beat everyone to the punch with their design in 1938, and that was the popular SpeedX and RateX bottoms that everyone talks about. And then in recent years, manufacturers have gone back to the separate point and share design, where you can replace a few points before you replace the share, and you can maybe even flip the point around to gain some life out of the point. So no matter what type of plow share you've got, if you're going to go after any replacement parts, you need to know what series or style of plow bottom that you have. For example, knowing that you have an International number 8 Little Genius plow does not help, because manufacturers years ago made many different designs of plow bottoms to suit different soil conditions. So you need to know what series of plow bottom you have. You can do that by finding the part number stamped on the back of the plowshare and the moldboard. You need both of those numbers because the share that you have might be an uncommon share, but knowing the series of plow bottom would tell you what the more common share part numbers are for that series of bottom. Because just like series of plow bottoms, manufacturers made many different styles of shares that would fit on a particular plow bottom. So now let's get to fixing on some plowshares. Now what's to come mainly applies to Blacksmith shares. However, if you've got a little 2 or 3 bottom plow, mounted plow or trailer plow that uses throwaway lays, and you've got trouble getting that thing to go in the ground, I would definitely pay attention. And even if you've got a bigger semi-mount plow with throwaway lays and you want to be a tightwad and make shares last longer, definitely follow along. So I'll start off with a story and some theory. Years ago, when Grandpa was farming, he used a 2-bottom Minneapolis Mullion plow, and he had 3 sets of shares for that plow. 1 set was on the plow, the 2nd set was good and hanging in the tool shed ready to go, and the 3rd set was at the blacksmith shop getting fixed. And that set that he had on the plow, he had to do some routine maintenance to it between trips to the blacksmith. And what he was doing was taking the share off the plow and grinding away the sled runner that would develop as the plowshare wore. So let me show you what I'm talking about. As the plowshare wears, the cutting edge becomes rounded off. So what you do is find the leading cutting edge of the share and then look below it and behind it. And anything shiny that the soil is rubbing on is what I call the sled runner, and that can ride the plow out of the ground. If the soil is mellow and moist, the soil will probably just deform around that sled runner and you'd never notice it. But if the ground is super hard, it's going to ride the plow out of the ground, and the plow is actually going to ride on that sled runner rather than sucking down and riding on the wheels like it's supposed to. So here's your plowshare theory. I hear so many people get concerned about suck of the share when they're talking about what I would call macro suck, but what's super critical is the micro suck or the sled runner of the share. In good going conditions, you might get away with like a 1/4 inch width of a sled runner. In super hard ground, if you can perceive that there's a sled runner there, it's going to ride the plow out of the ground. You've got to get rid of this and make this sharp. Because theoretically, a plow should not need any suck at all to go in the ground. If you think of a plow as a 3-cornered wedge, that plow should go in the ground until something, probably the landside, supports the plow, and it should just go along happily on its merry way. That's not practical because you go 5 feet and the share is going to start developing a sled runner and it's going to ride the plow out of the ground. So any suck in the plowshare is really just there to make up for wear. If you read if you read numerous old books, they're going to tell you that when measuring suck right here, you don't need much at all. Like maybe the most you'd ever read in a book is a ½ an inch, which seems excessive to me. And this is a brand new John Deere share, and man, what's that, 1/4 of an inch of suck? I've seen more than one Blacksmith plowshare rebuilt incorrectly with a point that points too far down, which creates too much suck. And this is why you don't do this. There's research out there that shows the relationship between the approach angle of the share and the fracture angle of the soil. In a nutshell, the flatter the better. So whenever you're working on your plowshare, think flat and sharp. Because as the approach angle increases, your fracture line becomes flatter and actually will go below plowing depth, and that's when you start pulling up chunks. And you don't want that. You want the plowshare to cleanly shear the soil off to create a nice plowing job. Long story short, you could have tons of macro suck, but if you have a sled runner at the cutting edge of your share, that's going to drive the plow out of the ground. Enough pontificating, let's do some grinding. The poopy part about grinding the sled runner away is you got to find the high spot, which is going to be about here, and then you have to do a ton of grinding to get rid of it. So I only ground one spot so you can see the difference. And then as you're going along, you can check your progress and kind of eyeball down the level of the furrow bottom, and you can see how much sled runner you're getting rid of. And I left just a little bit of a blunt edge there just so it can stand up to rocks better than having a super sharp, delicate cutting edge. I do most of my grinding on the bottom. I've heard from more than one person that you should grind on the bottom. I've heard some people mention grinding on the top. I'll do a little bit if the edge is really beat up and needs to be cleaned up, but most of the grinding is on the bottom. Now, if your experience is 100% with cast iron shares because you're from Ontario, Canada, that grinding on the top could be the right answer. I don't know. But if you're talking about a steel plowshare like this in North America, grind the sled runner on the bottom. So let's talk about the next level of maintenance to the plowshare, and that is doing some light rebuilding. And we'll do that by welding on a weld bead onto the cutting edge of the share. And you can surprisingly build up quite a bit to the point using this method also. What we'll need for this project is a plowshare, a chunk of brass for the plowshare to lay on, some random blocks of wood of different sizes, and some hard surfacing wire, in this case Studi 965G, and we'll load that into the MIG welder. I can't take credit for this method. I learned it from a world plowing competitor, and he probably learned it from another world plowing competitor, so I just thank the world plowing community for this method. So I have the hard surfacing wire loaded in the MIG welder. I have the rust cleaned off the plowshare, and I have the plowshare strategically placed on this chunk of brass. The trick is to get the angle of the plowshare just right, because that determines where the weld bead ends up. The beauty of this is as I weld along here, the weld bead will drip down and stop at this chunk of brass, and that will create a new cutting edge. And what this does for you is creates a new cutting edge and creates clearance behind that cutting edge so that you don't have to grind and grind and grind away the original material of the share to create that clearance and get rid of that sled runner. You also want to keep in mind, you want to continue that flow of the plowshare down to that cutting edge. You don't want to unnecessarily make a blunt edge or make the cutting edge turn up by having the angle of this plowshare wrong. Now I am down to working at the point. Very, very critical to get the angle just right. I have found putting the gunnel back of the gunnel of the share on the ground, in this case I have it shimmed up a little bit, usually comes up with the right angle over here. So let's get to work. Welding is done. I like it. This particular share had a weird wear pattern going on at the point, and I wanted it to look brand new. So it's going to take lots of grinding to get it back to look like the point on the right. Got to get the big mamba jamba out for this one. Here's the clearance I'm talking about. I'm grinding along here, and this is a low spot, so this is the clearance behind the cutting edge. Normally this would be where the sled runner is. I'd have to grind away. All right, all done, all ground down. This plowshare would penetrate concrete. I've got not a perfect knife edge, but a little bit of a blunt edge here. I don't want it to be a super knife edge because that just won't stand up to rocks. I did grind the very point down to a knife edge because I want this thing to go in the ground. And you can also eyeball down the gunnel here, and yep, it's got suck. And if the thing will focus on the point, there's no sled runner there to keep it out of the ground. Now the other beautiful thing about this technique is this plowshare should never ever wear out. If this weld bead ever wears down, I can just weld another weld bead on it and build that back up. So this could be a yearly or bi-yearly maintenance thing, and this plowshare should never wear out, except for, you know, if this would ever wear out here, but man, you'd have to plow hundreds and hundreds of acres to get this worn down to paper thin. So now let's rebuild a plowshare. I have a perfect candidate for rebuilding, a new plowshare to model against, some points to pick from, and a strip to weld on for the cutting edge. This share is a perfect candidate for rebuilding. It was a new crescent forge and shovel share that I have worn out over a few seasons. I've done my grinding on it, but if you eyeball down here, you'll see that there is absolutely no suck left in it, and plenty of sled runner back here, and there's just no grinding left to be done. It's done for. It needs to be rebuilt. At first glance, you might say, oh, this share looks like it's got plenty of life left. Lots of meat here. It's got a point. Looks fine. But if you're really serious about rebuilding plowshares, having a new plowshare for reference is really handy. So if we throw a tape measure on it and measure from the point back to your shin, I measure 10.5 on the new share, and I measure about 8 on the worn out share. So that's 2.5 inches worn off the point. And if I go back here and measure across this wing bolt as a reference, I measure 6.25. And if I measure here on this worn out share, I'm at 5.25. So an entire inch has been worn off along the cutting edge back here. So I've got an inch wide by 3/16 strip for the cutting edge, and that'll work perfect since I've got an inch worn off back here. And then I've got some points to pick from. I've got a simple point here. I've got a point with a cutting edge built into it, and I think this is pretty interesting. It gives you a little nub here that is probably meant to be a gauge for your suck, and then when you're done rebuilding, you grind that little nub off. And then we've got a point that I'm going to go with here. It gives you a portion to overlap your existing share, and I'm going to use this because when I measure the thickness of the share at the same point where this is going to come up on both shares, by golly, if this share isn't worn down the same thickness as this. So this is the idea with this point, is to bring this worn portion of the share up to original. Now, a few things to watch out for when rebuilding a plowshare. I've seen rebuilt plowshares ruined by placing your new cutting edge too far up, too far down on the share, putting too much suck into it. I've seen a cutting edge welded on too far down, and maybe the blacksmith was scared of cutting away the original material to get that cutting strip placed in the right spot. Personal experience, I put on a pair of plowshares on a plow that you could see had been rebuilt twice. You could see 2 weld beads in the backside here where 2 strips have been welded in. And I went out plowing with it, and all of a sudden the plow wanted to kick over to the left, over to the unplowed ground, and I thought, what on earth is going on here? Well, after some investigation, we noticed that the wing of the plowshare back here was quite a bit wider than the other plowshares. So it's plowing deeper over here. And to get the plow to plow the same depth, I had to raise the frame of the plow up, and in doing so, raise the land side up out of the furrow bottom, and now it's not there to support the plow, and the plow wants to kick over. So it's something to watch out for. If you screw up either corner of this plowshare, then it won't be plowing the same depth across the width. So let's get after it. I've got a little measuring jig here that represents the length of the new plowshare, and I'll use that to make a mark where to cut the old plowshare. It'll make here, it'll make a mark about here. So I'll cut off something that looks like this. And I need to measure 5 1/4 here. So when I add in this strip, it measures 6 1/4 like the new plowshare. So I'll make a mark about here that measures 5 1/4. And it looks like we're darn near 5 1/4 all along here. Okay. When I've got the nose cut off, we'll do some more looking and measuring and thinking about it. All right, here's the share ready for welding. New point will sit on here like this, and a new cutting edge will fit in like this. So here is my welding jig. I've got a chunk of brass here that's thick enough so it sits high enough up on the gunnel to get past that rounded, worn edge of the gunnel of the land side. I've got this big zip tie that's about 1/8 of an inch thick that I'll use to space off the original share this much off the piece of brass, just right here, and that's going to represent the amount of side suck I give it. I've got a 1/4 inch piece of strap underneath the original share, and that's going to gauge how much suck I'm going to give it. And I'll lay the new point on here, eyeball it from the top when it's lined up with the piece of brass. I'm lining it up with my mark, but I'll double check here with the tape measure that I've got my 10 1/2 inch measurement, and we're ready to tack it in. Now let's tack in the strip. Another thing to watch out for when you're rebuilding plowshares, to make sure you're putting your cutting strip on and maintaining that same flow of the plowshare. I've seen plowshares ruined that have quite a twist in them. They flatten out quite a bit towards the wing of the share, and guys don't follow that curve, so then the cutting edge of the share back here goes down, and you end up cutting deeper at the wing end, and that's not a good thing. So now that we've got the pieces tacked in, I'm going to preheat the piece before welding for two reasons. My little wire feed welder is not rated to weld stuff quite this thick. And number two, this plowshare is high carbon steel, and without preheating, the weld beads will crack as it cools down. I'm only going to put enough heat in it to make it just to start turning blue. So now that I got the point burned in, I'm going to start welding on the strip. And I'll weld the back side first, and then weld the top side to try to get the top side to burn in and not create such a high bead that I have to weld, that I have to grind down. Now that I've got the major pieces burnt in and welded in for good, I'm going to turn the heat down on the welder and build up this area here to bring it up to the level of this new point. And there you go, all welded up. I made sure the last weld beads I made along here filling in this depression go in the same direction that the soil flows. When I grind it down, I'll grind it fairly smooth, but it doesn't need to be super perfect. And in that way, if there's lines left in here from the weld beads, the soil will still flow well. And then the last step is to stick this warm plowshare in a big bucket of floor dry to insulate it and let it cool slowly. So now that the share is cooled off, I'm going to do some grinding. I'm going to grind down this weld bead smooth. I'm going to bevel on the back side here to sharpen the cutting edge, and I'm going to grind this down as little as possible. Remember, this is where the most soil pressure is, so leaving as much material as possible is good, but I still want to make it somewhat smooth. If you live in Western Ohio and have really heavy clay ground, or you have coarse gravelly ground because you live in the eastern US, maybe you don't need to worry so much about scouring, but here on the fruited plains, I need to make things as smooth as possible to give it every best chance to scour. There you go, a rebuilt plowshare ready to go back into service. Ground down nice and smooth, cutting edge sharpened so the plow will go in the ground. That's the video, thanks for watching. And if you made it this far, did I mention you need to grind the sled runner on the back side of your cutting edge to get the plow to go in the ground?